The Training Accreditation Council acknowledges the Aboriginal peoples of Western Australia as traditional custodians of the lands and waters. It honours their wisdom, cultures, languages and communities and pays respect to the elders past, present and emerging.
Welcome everyone. There might be a couple of stragglers join us in a few minutes, but we'll kick off. It's always good to start on time for those that did get here on time. So again, welcome everyone. As always, at these events, it's always fantastic to see so many people here today, and we really hope that you find today's event engaging and useful. For those that don't know me, my name's Marina Stanley. I head up the Training Accreditation Council Secretariat as the Director Training Regulation. I'd like to thank you all for spending the morning with us here today. And by the way, this is an exclusive event just for TAC RTOs. So as you know, usually in our professional development sessions, they are open to all, but today it's a special event just for you. As we continue with today's program, I'd also like to introduce the chairperson of the Training Accreditation Council, Anne Driscoll. Anne, for many of you, you will know Anne from some of her past roles. She has a lot of experience in her career across the West Australian Government, with over 20 years actually in senior executive positions, leadership roles, including most recently as the Director General of the Department of Training and Workforce Development, which is where probably most of you will know the name from. And in her past before that has also been the Director General of the Department of Commerce and also Commissioner for Consumer Protection. And through all of that has developed obviously very strong and in-depth knowledge of the vet sector, particularly through her role as the Director General of the Department of Training and Workforce Development, both at a state and national level. And obviously through her consumer protection days brings with her a lot of compliance and regulatory experience with her to her current role as Chair of TAC. So I would like to welcome Anne to the stage just to say a few words and welcome you all today as well.
Thanks so much, Marina, and it's great to be here today. Can I thank you for being present? In many ways, your presence here is a demonstration of your commitment to your personal development and to a belief in excellence in the vet sector. So thank you for attending and being part of today's event. In starting this morning, I'd like to acknowledge that outstanding welcome from Robin, but may I'm sure along with you also acknowledge that today we are meeting on the land of the Whadjuk Noongar people, and I'm sure with you we collectively pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. In addition to me being a council member present today, we've actually got 3 other members, and I'd just like to ask them if they don't mind to perhaps raise their hand or stand, because it's an opportunity for you to meet with all of us today, share any thoughts and comments that you have, and we'd just like to know any issues that you perceive. So may I invite Karen Carter to just indicate. No doubt many of you know Karen, perhaps you also know Louise Hillman, who's with us today, and also Bill Sweatman. So we have 4 of our 7 members along today, both to enjoy this learning opportunity and also get to know you. So I'd invite you to have a chat with us at morning tea, etc. I'd like also to talk briefly about the role of the council and our collective experience over the last few months. In my case, I've been the chair for just over 12 months, so some of my observations during that period. As you know, TAC is WA's vet regulator, and we're responsible for quality assurance in our industry in WA. When I was reflecting on, the TAC is responsible for quality assurance, it occurred to me that actually we are united in that effort because your presence here, as I said, demonstrates your commitment to quality, and in many ways our collective effort assures the reputation of the vet sector. And I again acknowledge your commitment to that. I think it's fair to say as a council, we see that RTOs are genuinely committed to compliance, and in part that's through your very active participation in the TAC education program, which has been outstanding of late. We've seen real increases in the engagement, which is also, of course, testament to the quality and range of tools that are being made available to you. Additionally, of late, we've seen some encouraging positive direction in RTO compliance trends. But as you know, maintaining compliance and maintaining this trend is a constant and active commitment by us all in terms of continuing to check and revisit our settings. It occurs to me that this positive trend is particularly impressive given overall RTOs have been dealing with a hell of a lot over the last few years. Not only has there been a massive increase in the levels of training activity overall, you've also been grappling with the many complexities and challenges of COVID. In some ways, there has been a really good thing that's happened over the last 2 years or so, and that is a real appreciation of the importance of vet. The workforce shortages that we've seen in WA and, of course, nationally and internationally have then been responded to through extra funding and a recognition of the importance of vet. And what's been fabulous is that you guys have really stood up and responded to the challenge. And I think we've seen a really great improvement in the profile of vet and a recognition of its importance and how much it is the fabric of our capacity as an economy and as a community. To support RTOs in achieving quality, the Council's really committed to supporting you in a range of ways, but as you know, the extensive education program is a particular focus, and I really acknowledge the team in terms of ensuring the material is practical and also is in various forms that mean it's accessible to you, be it in these workshops, webinars, podcasts, etc., and through a range of forms in terms of tools and seminars, etc. Today is an annual event, as I understand it, and obviously exclusive to our TAC RTOs. So, you're in a trusted environment. We're all sharing the same experience. It is an opportunity to be open and inquiring of our great speakers today. The program, of course, will continue to unfold, and I can assure you that next year's program will be, again, continuing the theme of varied forms, but also responsive to emerging issues. And, I welcome your engagement with that as it unfolds. So well done to the TAC team on maintaining a really active and interesting program and ensuring it's evolving in form to meet your needs in the busy world that you operate in. In concluding, I again want to congratulate you and the wider collective of RTOs on your commitment to learning through participating in today's event, through your very high engagement with the education program broadly. And can I say that today's not only a workshop opportunity, but of course the emphasis too is being in the same room with colleagues and sharing issues and solutions to problems. The Council hopes you enjoy today, and we very much invite you to engage with us over the breaks, etc. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Anne, and we certainly appreciate you taking time out to be here today, and also some of the council members that Anne's introduced. So as Anne mentioned, they will be here for the duration of the session. They'll be joining in some of the workshops and staying till the end. So please take the time to introduce yourself, make yourself known, and have a chat about what's going on. I also would like to acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people on whose lands we meet today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So I also want to acknowledge that many of you have been providers for a very, very long time, and that is a credit to you and your organisation. And more than anyone here in the room, you really deserve a big pat on the back for continuing to serve industry with job-ready graduates while enduring all that VET throws at you, which I know is not easy, even the stuff that, the things that we are often having to manage as well. So we get it, we understand it, it's tough, and there's a lot for RTOs to do and manage whilst doing your core business of training your learners. So a little bit about the council before we kick off the workshop. So the council has a long-standing presence in WA. In fact, they held their first meeting 25 years ago, back in January 1997 on a Saturday, with the council recently acknowledging their 300th meeting, so quite a significant milestone. I think many of you it's well understood, and from first-hand experience also, where you've engaged with the council's regulatory approach, and I think most of you would agree that the approach that the council has really aims to support quality vet outcomes through a balanced and proportionate risk-based approach to regulation and a culture of continuous improvement. And I want to just focus on continuous improvement and quality in the sector, given that they are the focus of today's workshops. Maintaining a culture of continuous improvement is supported by TAC through a number of strategies, as most of you are aware, and some of those strategies are more overt than others. For example, RTOs and stakeholders tell us that they appreciate and value that direct and personal access to the Secretariat staff, who are available to assist or provide clarification on any registration or regulatory matter that you have. Also, more than 80% of our providers tell us that when we come out and see you at audit, that audit is a worthwhile experience, and being able to engage with our auditors, and that process does actually add value to your business operations. And of particular relevance and significance today is TAC's support of the sector through the education and guidance that the council provides. And all these strategies and approaches aim to assist you in achieving the outcomes for your students and industry in the vet sector at large. While support and guidance has been a key feature of the council's approach for many years, the introduction of the current standards for RTOs in 2015 really provided the impetus and, in a way, permission for vet regulators to provide and support providers in the way that we do now. We've certainly established ourselves, I think, as a key contributor to professional development of vet staff in WA. There's not too many around doing what we're able to do, and I think as a regulator, providing that support and guidance certainly raises I think provides some credibility to that support and guidance, and you can trust the information that we're providing is in line with what we would expect, and I think is key to the development work that we do. So since 2015, as Anne mentioned, we've certainly expanded the program quite exponentially. And we really work hard to make sure that the information and guidance that we do provide for you is meaningful and helps you facilitate quality training outcomes. A quick touch base on some of you will be across some of the national quality reforms that are ongoing at the moment through the Commonwealth's Department of Education, Skills and Employment. So there are proposed changes coming up to the standards for RTOs. I don't have too much to report at this time, given we know the Commonwealth is in election mode, and obviously caretaker protocols have delayed some of the work that may have been anticipated to have been released by now. But we do know that that there are going to be some adjustments, some revisions to the standards for RTOs coming in, likely to be next year. And I just wanted to, on behalf of the Council, assure you all that TAC is committed to supporting our providers in the rollout of the new standards, obviously to support you through a smooth transition and implementation across all providers, as we did last time. So we will have a suite of support material and obviously always available on the phone to support you through that transition. The Commonwealth are anticipating that a draft revised set of standards may be available for public consultation around mid-year. So look out for that. If you haven't already, subscribe to the skills reform page at the Commonwealth Department of Education, Skills and Employment website. Some of you will already have engaged with that site and provided feedback already on the draft standards. In the meantime, the Council continued to provide a comprehensive education program that includes workshops on topics integral to assist you meet your compliance obligations. The design and development of our program is informed by really just talking with our providers about what you're interested in, what your issues are. That helps us really target where our effort in the development of our programs, which is really important. Feedback from past participants of our workshops, what we can do better, what people felt was missing, etc. And of course, through the stream of calls and emails that we receive in the office, we talk amongst ourselves as a team in terms of what are the issues people are raising, what are the questions people are asking, and of course that also informs where we want to target our effort. Audit reports also give us quite a lot of information around where we want to target our support, and the compliance, and with that obviously the compliance data, which also informs the priority focus areas and focuses the Council's regulatory response in terms of some of those areas where we might see some worrying issues. And of course, talking with our auditors, they're out there and they're talking with you at the coalface, and so that's another way that we can collect information that helps us really customise and contextualise the support that we're providing. And as mentioned before, we offer a suite of formats so that you're able to, if you can't get to something in person, then you're able to jump on the web, go to a recording. We have a number of fact sheets, an extensive suite of fact sheets, which just provide, I think, in simple language, some really good guidance to help you work through your compliance obligations. You might also be aware, just a quick plug, we have a LinkedIn page, so follow us if you don't already, and you'll find a lot of our recordings on our YouTube channel as well. Anne mentioned earlier some positive compliance outcomes that we're starting to see. We know both anecdotally and through our compliance data that attendance at TAC education programs can assist RTOs with their compliance levels. And we'll shortly be releasing some data to RTOs about compliance, specifically at the clause level. We've been tracking compliance trends since 2018, and so we've been starting to see some interesting trends, as I said, and the results are positive. The data is telling us that RTO compliance is improving over time, and in some clauses in particular, quite significantly, which is really terrific news, and we're really excited to share that information with you very soon. And we think that improvement over time can be attributed to a number of factors. We think since the introduction of the current standards for RTOs, the sector has increased in its maturity in terms of its familiarity with the standards. And of course, through that, you're embedding quality practice in your organisations through undertaking your internal audit or continuous improvement processes, which is terrific. We're seeing that at audit, and our auditors, when we get together with them, are also reporting that they're seeing that as well. And of course, RTOs are investing in the capability of their staff, which is fantastic. With increasing opportunities for RTO staff to attend professional development opportunities, whether it's through TAC or any other organisation. So we'll be able to release the data in the coming weeks, and we really hope that you find it of interest. Lastly, thank you again for your participation. We're thrilled to see you today, and that I hope that today you do gain some useful insights. We would appreciate some feedback after today's event, so we will be sending you a quick survey that'll be sent to you after the event in a few days. So if you can spare a few minutes, we'd really love to hear from you. Again, thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for coming. I know all of our speakers so far have expressed, that's great to be able to be in the room with everyone. I'm very excited to actually be in the room with all of you this morning and to be actually talking about something that we don't often talk about in the vet sector, the training part of what it is that we do. We haven't figured out our signs yet. So Lisa's going to give you some handouts that we will use throughout the session, and typically in these kinds of sessions we tell you to put your phones away, but I'd like you to get your phones out because you're going to need to use them. So when we think about quality, it's something that we all strive for in the vet sector. We want to provide the best learning and assessment experience that we can for our students. However, quality is a bit of an elusive term in our sector. We have tried for many, many years to define what quality is, what it looks like, and to date we don't actually have a commonly accepted definition of quality in our sector. The reality is that for each of us, quality means a different thing. And according to all of the research, what we think quality is going to depend on the context within which we operate. So it's really about that question of what am I trying to achieve? So am I trying to engage disengaged learners, for example? Am I addressing a particular industry need? Am I trying to make a profit? Am I building the bench strength of my organisation? Am I targeting career changes? Depending upon my answers to these questions, I'm likely to value a particular outcome. And hopefully, I'm actually going to adopt strategies and approaches in my training and assessment that are actually going to help me achieve that outcome. So what works well and may be considered quality in one context may actually be considered quite differently in another. And let me give you a bit of an example. So many, many years ago now, I was involved in a series of audits for TAC, might have been very early on in my long history with them, where we were looking at outcomes that were being achieved by some RTOs that were in receipt of public funding. And several of these RTOs had actually been flagged for audit because their completion rates and their qualifications were really low. So one of the organisations that I visited actually had a completion rate of 0. So I can see in the room, people are a little bit shocked by that. But let me tell you that I have actually never seen training and assessment that was so valuable and where the outcomes were actually so exceptional as for this training. This organisation was working in a remote community where they had some really significant issues with child health, with child development and mortality issues. And in trying to address that need in the community, they had partnered with a training organisation who were going to provide some training to the young mums in the community about things like child development, nutrition, hygiene, play, all of those things that we would want young mums to know about. The outcomes of those training in the community was measured by things like visits to the community health centre, whether developmental milestones were met by the children, whether they had disease outbreaks in the community. And when you actually looked at what the RTO did, they spent weeks and weeks in the community with those young mums, and in fact with anybody else who wanted to learn and to help improve the outcomes for their young people. So it was really collaborative training. It was culturally appropriate training. It was targeted to a specific need. It was responsive to that need, and it worked. So in the context of completion rates, wasn't a good outcome. In the context of what was actually important, the child health outcomes, it was exceptional. So in any one context, what we do can be exceptional, and in another context, we might consider it as worrying. So when we look at what we're going to talk about this morning, it's really the idea of exploring what quality training is by discussing a few things. What quality training looks like in practice, what to think about when you're choosing an approach for your learner group, how to plan teaching and learning, something we don't see a lot of people doing. Approaches to structuring on-the-job learning. Again, it's something that over time has changed in the way we focus on what happens in the workplace. Supporting the workplace to support your learners, and actually talk to you about some resources that might support training in the classroom and in the workplace. So we're going to touch on a lot of these things through the 55 minutes that we have together, but it's a very short time period. So we're going to point you to some resources that might help you along the way there. So we have also already heard this morning that there are comments about the vet sector about it being particularly complex and diverse, and the environment that we operate in being such. What we have actually been successful in agreeing on is an explanation of what quality achieves. And so over the past 20 years, NCBR has actually been conducting research around quality, and this has culminated in a report that was released very recently, where they identified 4 characteristics of quality training and assessment. So this information is actually sitting on page 1 of your handout, and those 4 things are that training is transformational, and what that means is it's how well the students are achieving and developing throughout the training process, that it's student-centred, how well the students are actually supported and encouraged to learn throughout that process, that it's fit for purpose, that is how well the stakeholders' needs and purposes are met, and we tend to have a diverse range of stakeholders in the vet sector, and that it is evolutionary. And that is really about how well it adapts to changing stakeholder and workplace needs. So the trick for us is really having a look at these 4 things and saying, okay, they're nice, easy to remember words, but what does that look like in practice on a day-to-day basis for us in RTOs? So this is where I'm going to ask you to use your phones. On your handouts, you will see that there's a QR code for session 1. I want you to scan that QR code. So you can do that using your camera, or you can use a QR code reader if you have it, and it should take you to a Padlet site. So there'll be a little yellow bar that pops up, says padlet.com. Click on that. So I want to actually ask you a question, because again, I'm going to acknowledge something that Marina said, in that many of you in this room have in fact been in this sector for a very long time and will have pretty clear ideas about what quality looks like on a day-to-day basis. So if you tap on the little pink cross that's in the bottom corner there, you will see a panel pop up that actually allows you to type your comments in. When you click on publish, your comment's going to appear up here. So what I would like you to do is to answer that question. What does quality training look like in practice? And I'm going to give you 2 minutes to start popping your comments up there. So engaging is a very strong one that is appearing up there. There we want people to actually want to learn and feel supported to learn. Concurrency is popping up, flexibility is popping up, fairness, contextualised to meet people's needs, being able to transfer knowledge and skills from the learner and then that learner into the workplace. I remember my dad talking to me about lectures once and telling me a lecture was a place where the notes of the lecturer became the notes of the student without passing through the mind of either. So I'll always remember that. Having those outcomes verified, and that typically means that industry will be happy with what it is that you are doing, and that when your learners end up in the workplace, they're able to do the things that industry expects them to be able to do. So the fact that we can sit here as a group and we can have a consistent outcome where we say these are all the things that are actually important to us when we think about what quality looks like on a day-to-day basis is a really positive outcome. Now, in your handouts, there is space for you to madly write all of this down if you would like to. However, one of the joys of this app, which is called Padlet, is that we are able to send you a PDF copy of this. So what sits here in your feedback into this slide, as well as the next session's feedback into this, will be sent to everyone so that you have got a cohesive view of what we think as a room is quality training and assessment. So over the years that I've been involved in the vet sector now, which is coming up to 37 years, soon someone's going to tell me I've been working here for half a century. You know, what we see written up here hasn't changed dramatically over that time. Instinctively, I think those of us who want to be involved in training and assessment understand what quality is. It's just how do we transfer it into things that we do on a day-to-day basis that in fact helps us generate that kind of outcome. So in the rest of the session, what we're actually going to do is we're going to look at a couple of different things or areas that we can focus on where if we do these things, we do make an impact on achieving these quality outcomes. And the first of those things is choosing an approach that might suit your learner group. So ideally, you will know the typical learner that comes to you, but that is not always possible. And you know, we need to ask some questions about these people. When we have very short courses where, you know, we might only have them for a short period of time, often we'll be looking at trends in the people that come to us to answer these kinds of questions. When you deliver qualifications where you have students for a much longer time, obviously you're able to get to know them a lot better and you'll be able to answer a lot more of these questions. When I look at delivery and assessment strategies, most often I will see descriptions of learner groups that in fact mirror what I talked about earlier when I said those questions. It'll say, I have school leavers, I have career changers, I have an equity group, and there won't be much other information. And what we really want to know is what is it about these people that would change the way we offer training to them. So demographics is one of the things that we might look at. Group characteristics, the context in which that learning is happening, what the expectations are of that group, their prior knowledge, what the attitude of the group is, any learning preferences that they might have, what kind of technical skills they might have as a group, and barriers to learning. So they're big general areas. And if you turn to page 3 of your handout, you will see that we've listed a whole lot of possible questions that you could ask, and then think about what the implications of those questions might be for the training and assessment. So I'm just going to pick out a few examples. Are they geographically dispersed? You might choose to use a technology option to conduct the training if that was the case. What's the level of urgency for the training for these people? This might affect the way you timetable the training that's offered to them. So it could be full day intensive sessions, or it might be a few hours a week over a few months if it's not something that's particularly urgent. What kind of people are they? Are they introverts, extroverts? Personality, other qualities such as, are they empathetic? Are they particularly driven? If you have a group of driven extroverts, they're not going to want to read and answer questions. If you have a mix of introverts and extroverts in the room with you and you're going to do group work, you need to think carefully about how you place them, or the groups won't work. So there's all kinds of things that you can learn about the group that you're dealing with that might then impact the approach that you would use for training that group. Sometimes, as I said, these are things that you will need to look at trends for amongst your learner group to try and pick the right type of approach. Other times you'll have a general idea, and this will be something that you refine as you spend more and more time with the learners. When we understand the learners, we need to be clear about what it is we're actually trying to teach them. So units of competency actually describe workplace outcomes, and they don't tell us the learning objectives that we should be addressing. And so we need to clearly understand the unit of competency itself and what its application in industry is. And we also need to think about what we would need to teach someone to allow them to be competent in industry. And so this means we have to think about what's going to happen in that cycle of learning, practice and assessment. So we have probably all seen something like this before. Every single WHS unit course that I have ever seen has got something like this in it. It's a risk assessment matrix for those of you who have been fortunate enough not to be exposed to this. This is typically what sits in the learner guide, is typically what sits in the PowerPoint slides that you will often see accompanying that learner guide. Often sits in a discrete section. It would sometimes show you the definitions of what those things mean. So it might tell you what catastrophic means. It might tell you what minor means. It might tell you what improbable means. But often that's not there. The next section typically is about the hierarchy of control. And it lists the hierarchy, and again, sometimes it might give you some examples, but often that's rare. What I almost never see is us teaching the students what they're supposed to do with this and how they're supposed to use it. So I will see in assessments, for example, people that do this matrix, and they will put a control in place, for example, that might change the probability of something happening. When you look at how they have used this matrix, however, and their responses for that control, they will change the severity rating, which shouldn't be changing. That's not what we are controlling. So we don't have a clear idea of what it is we're supposed to be teaching these people, or an objective of what we're trying to achieve when we do this kind of stuff. And what we're really looking for is how we actually define the objective for that learning. So again, this is something that many of you will have seen before. To write a SMART objective, we talk about it all the time. So really the question we're asking is, what do we want the learner to be able to do differently at the end of this period of learning? SMART means that it's specific. It says exactly what the learner is going to be able to do. It's measurable. That means it can be observed at the end of the training session. It's attainable. That actually means that the participants within that scheduled time and conditions can actually achieve whatever that outcome is. It's relevant to the needs of the participant and the organisation, and it's time framed. It's achievable by the end of that training session. So seeing a learning outcome written is something that I almost never see. I see topics written, not learning outcomes. So let's look at these two objectives. The first one is typically an objective that we might link to what we talked about before with the risk matrix. Learners will understand risk assessment. I might as well ask you, how long is a piece of string? When we think about whether this is smart, which of our happy face icons are we going to tick? Is it a smart objective? Is it neutral? Or is it definitely not a smart objective? What do you think? Down, down. We're going to have a sad face on that one. It's definitely not a smart objective. It really, as soon as we see the word understand, it should ring alarm bells for everybody. Let's have a look at the next example. So at the end of the session, the learners will be able to choose control measures that will reduce risk in the mechanical workshop. I'll ask you the same question. Is this a smart objective? What do you think? Yes? No? Maybe? 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 Okay. Mike? Why do you think it's a maybe?
I just think it's a bit woolly. I don't think it's specific enough.
Mm-hmm.
Time frame's okay. End of the session, so there's a loose time frame in there, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
I just think it's a bit open. Still a bit open. There's more better than the first one. Still a bit open.
Still a bit open. Okay. Lisa, can you come down to Viv?
I just think we should have more about the control measures. So maybe how many control measures or what we were meant to do with the control measures. So it's just a little bit more context around the control measures.
Okay. Okay. So we've definitely improved, but we haven't got it right yet. Okay. What I want you to do in your groups is just to spend 1 minute to get it right. Write me a smart objective. Okay, let's see if we have a group that is willing to share their smart objective. We have a volunteer. If you don't volunteer, I'm going to volunteer you, just so you know. Okay. I think we might go to the group at the back that is right in front of Mike. Elect a spokesperson and tell us your smart objective.
Right, so at the end of the session, learners will be able to use a risk assessment matrix to assess the level of risk and select appropriate control measures to reduce the risk in a mechanical workshop.
Pretty good. You're getting votes of confidence from up the front here. I like it, I heard. Okay, any other group want to tell us or share their objective with us? I think we can have this group in the middle here, Satpal. Our Ag College friends.
Look at that, they all toss you under the bus, don't they? Look, we were working on the section in the middle there, and we did come up with to choose an appropriate control measure that will obviously identify those risks in that mechanical workshop, but really like what the previous group had indicated about linking back to the risk assessment matrix, and linking that as that specific part of what you're actually looking for. So well done.
Yes. Yeah, they did a great job. Anyone else like to share?
We just basically said at the end of the session, learners will be able to conduct a pre-start audit or inspection within the mechanical workshop. Just kept it simple.
Okay. Okay. So we have 3 different examples, all narrowing in on those things that we know are important when we write smart objectives. It seems really simple to think about it in those terms. It's actually a little bit harder in practice to get into the habit of coming up with those objectives. So well done, and thank you for sharing. once we understand our learner group and we understand, and I'm using the naughty word, what it is that we have to teach them, because we have some clear learning objectives that we have to achieve, we start to think about the instructional methods that potentially we might use. And this image is here for a very particular purpose, in that quite literally this list of methods or approaches that you could use for teaching and learning are never ending, and they are ever expanding. So many years ago when I was in Prague and I was standing in this little shop buying stacking dolls that were actually in the AFL football team, so I bought my Dockers set. Go Dockers! We get very excited about a year when we do well. The lady there said to me, I said to her, "Oh, Russian dolls, I didn't expect to get Russian stacking dolls here." And she said, "They're not Russian. They're Czech." And it's just a regional thing. So this list, quite literally, as I've said, is never ending, it is ever expanding, and it's about choosing what is right for the group that you have. On page 5 of your handout, you've got a bit of a list. The A to Z of teaching methods. And you'll see on that list that there are lots and lots of examples of things that you might be able to do, might be able to use in your training. When you think about that list and you think about the group, it's really about choosing what's right for the group that you have. For example, student podcasts is one of the options that is on here. Now, if you had a really tech-savvy group, this might be a really great way to get them to actually do research, to organise information, to use their tech skills, and to develop confidence in speaking in public. If you had a group that was not tech-savvy and learning to do a podcast was not one of the objectives of the unit of competency, you're probably making it much harder for those people than in fact it needs to be. It wouldn't be a great way for them to be learning. You might, however, choose a different method, and they might have to do presentations. So they're still going to have to do research, they're still going to have to organise information, and they're still going to have to develop confidence speaking. Where those are the outcomes, we can have two very different approaches that achieve the outcome for the group that you are aiming at. So it's about choosing what's right for your group. There is no one right way to do this. Over the years, the people that I've met who are exceptional facilitators tend to have a file or a folder. And in that folder, they have all these different activities that they can use with the different groups that they have. So when they have a group that is tech savvy, they will do one thing to achieve the outcome. When they have one that isn't, they will do something completely different. It all achieves the outcomes, but it allows them choice to adapt and move with the group. That's something, of course, that's built over time, and we don't expect you to have it instantaneously. So then we start to put it all together into a plan for the learning and the practice. And what we've got here is we've got two examples. These are on page 6 of your handout. And group 1 is school leavers, tech savvy. They're keen to learn quickly and get into the workplace so that they can earn some money. And they don't really have any prior experience of risk assessment. Our second group of learners are career changers. They're also tech savvy, and they want to understand the ins and outs of the work that they're changing to, and they want to be challenged. I have a lot of experience in hospitality workplaces, and these people have conducted risk assessments before. If we were thinking about our learning outcome, our SMART outcome that we had from the back group, what kind of measures or what kind of approaches or methods would suit these different groups? So I just want you to spend, again, just a minute to think about what would you do with the first group And what would you do with the second group? What approaches would you use? All right, so this time we might go to our front group here. What kind of approaches are you going to use?
Hi.
Hi.
We didn't have much time.
I know.
So, thank you. So the first group as opposed to the second group, we thought that classroom discussions, dramatisation and case studies, because they have no industry experience, prior experience, and that's what we got to.
Okay, fantastic. But that would certainly work with the first group. What about this group here? Would you like to talk about what you did for the second group?
Just to add to the first group, we just felt that they obviously have no fundamental knowledge of the topic, so you first have to establish that knowledge base. They obviously would like to move through it quickly, but you need to ground them first to make sure that they understand, get the knowledge. The second group, they probably need to summarise and just solidify the knowledge, but then do more of an application through scenario setting and workshopping, group discussions, etc., and learn, or let some of that learning that they've gathered over the 25 years, share that knowledge and experience with each other and apply it to a specific situation.
Yeah, that's right. And they might, the things that you put in the dramatisations for the, or however you're doing it for the second group, it's really about transfer of that knowledge and skills that they already have into whatever that new context might be. So nothing that we have talked about is hard. It just takes a bit of time and effort and focus to actually do it. And often the thoughts that sit around what happens in that planning is something that you might see in something that we might call a lesson plan or a session plan. And the vast majority of plans that I see for delivery and assessment are really just content lists. And I should probably more accurately say they're content bullet points. Okay. So very few really structure or plan what is going to be undertaken in a session of learning. And they provide little or no guidance to the trainers about what is actually to happen. So in audit situations, what happens is I tend to get presented with a mapping that includes learning resources. They'll often have pages from a learner guide that are then repeated on a PowerPoint slide, and I mean word for word. Sometimes it's identical. Often there are so many slides that the only word we could really use to describe it is voluminous. And when you think about it from a training point of view and think about how that, for example, might work in a gas test atmospheres training course, for example, that's typically half a day. It doesn't. So probably the most extreme example I've seen was 138 PowerPoint slides for a 3-hour course. And so you take away 15 minutes for the setup, hello, how are you? You take away 15 minutes for the morning tea, and you take away an hour for assessment, and all of a sudden you have 138 slides in 90 minutes. That's a slide full of text every 40 seconds. So when we talk to the trainers and assessors and actually say, how do you use these? It's probably not going to be surprising when the answer is, we don't. They can't. It's not possible to do it. And when they do talk about what they do, it's more about what we would expect. We have a discussion about this, we focus on a few key slides, we do some demonstrations, we do this. That's the plan for how the learning happens. That's what we want to know addresses all of the requirements of the unit. So when we think about what should sit in a session plan, that session plan should guide what we want the trainers and assessors to do in the times that they have the learners with them. Now, there's no set format for what a session plan would look like, but we've got a couple of examples here for you that you might like to consider. So often these days we'll see something that sits in a PowerPoint like the example that you have on your right. So it will have information in there about the tasks that are going to be done, what you want to happen or what you want the learners to do. In this case, they're putting something into a chat box. And you have the key points for the trainer assessor about what they need to focus on out of the responses from the learners. So we know what it is that we're expecting to happen in response to whatever the visual cue is that sits on that slide. In this case, they were watching a video and then they were responding to what was in that video. More traditionally, you would see something like is what is sitting on your left. And in this instance, you can see again that these people have gone through, this is from a children's services organisation, they have gone through, they're talking about the quality framework that exists in children's services and what each of the standards mean in there. There's a range of activities that they're going to do, and you've got notes for the trainer about what it is that you want them to focus on out of those activities. So as I said, there is no one way to do this. There are in fact lots of ways to do it, and it's about picking what is right for the way your organisation runs. In the handout on the last page, on page 11, you'll see that there in that middle section there's a thing that says session plan templates. So there's a couple of templates in there that you could draw from if this was not something that you were already doing in your organisation. Now, so far, everything we've talked about has really been about the classroom, what might happen in a classroom. But of course, in the vet sector, lots of things happen in the workplace. Lots of training happens in the workplace. And when we think about that, and you think about, you know, what we see happening in traineeships and in apprenticeships, sometimes what we will see is when that learning happens in the workplace, we might send someone a workbook that's typically been structured for a classroom, and it's not useful and it's not structured workplace training. We might give people links to websites and then we don't tell them what we want them to do with the information that sits on those websites. What do you want them to learn from that? What do you want them to do with the information? So when you have workplace training, whether it be a work placement, whether it be a traineeship or whether it be an apprenticeship, what we want to do is make sure that when we enlist someone else to help us with the training and assessment, that we give them that structure that is actually going to help them provide a quality training experience for the people that are in their workplaces. So we need to think about how we're going to collaborate between the three parties that are typically involved: the learner, the RTO and the workplace. Now, on page 7 of your handout, we have got 6 categories. That is understanding what is going to happen in the workplace. So we might want to understand what the work is of the workplace, who the workplace staff are, the kind of time that might be available to the learner, what the site actually does, what learning has to be achieved, and who this learner is. So there's a number of questions that you're in fact going to ask around these things. For example, with the work, we might say, does the workplace do the range of work that's required by the units of competency? In the workplaces of today, it's very common for the answer to that to be no. In which case you might have to think about that workplace training, how is it going to be spread across a range of workplaces? If we're thinking about the workplace staff, we might be asking questions like, who's supervising and working with the student? What is their experience? Do they know everything that we need them to know so that they can actually be helpful for our learner, because they are our learner, that is in that workplace? When we're talking about time, it might be how much time is the learner going to have to actually study in the workplace and practice things in the workplace. So there's lots and lots of questions that you might ask. What I am going to get you to do, and I'm going to divide the room into half. So this side of the room, or in that row, I want you to do the first two, the work and workplace staff. Tables in the middle row do time and the site, and tables on this side of the room do the learning and the learner. And what I want you to do is not to spend 10 minutes, but just to spend 5 minutes jotting down some questions that you would like to ask or would ask in setting up the training that might happen in the workplace. Okay, so I know that was a very short time period to do that. I'm just going to get a couple of responses from each area. So Lisa, we'll start with the table at the front. Just give us 2 or 3 of the questions that you're going to ask for each of the 2 areas you worked on, which is the work and the workplace staff.
For the work, one of the questions was, is the full range of work tasks available for the student in the workplace? We also asked, did the work tasks cover the requirements of the unit of competency or units of competency? We asked, were the tasks within the scope of practice of the individual to perform in the workplace? We often find that the unit might say X, which is fine in simulation, but they're not able to actually do that in the workplace.
Yep.
With regards to the staff, we asked, were the staff trained and available for the students, or are they current themselves with the skills required? Will the staff be able to provide quality training, and do they understand what training is actually required and what support's available for them? And importantly, we asked, will the staff actually be kind, supportive and nurturing to the student on their learning journey as well?
Yes, really important. Thank you. Okay, we might just get you to run across the front, Lisa. Yep. So our middle group are talking about time and the site.
With time, we discussed what time was needed, what time was available, when was the time available, duration of training, and duration of assessment.
Yep.
As for the site inspection, site induction, the learning area requirements, and the equipment available on that site.
Yes, the equipment available is a really interesting one because often we don't get currently used equipment on some sites. It's really important. Thank you. And we're going to come to the group at the front. Satpal, you were doing the learning and the learner.
Sorry, I'm being docked in again. We're doing the learning, so obviously all according to the unit of competency, but we said the outcomes are important.
Yep.
The resources required and their availability, including obviously equipment. What is mandatory and what is not.
Yes.
The assessment conditions required, and different roles within whatever the unit of competency is, the supervisor, the student, the RTO supporting them in.
Yes.
Yeah. And then with the learner, obviously we came back to your page before about the age, the demographic, the experience, the characteristics of the learner, what are the expectations, what's the attitude required, their language, literacy and numeracy skills, obviously including foundation skills with that, their interest in the subject, and what is the final goal for the learner.
Yes.
And I use the example for myself. We train Ed Support, some want to be education assistants, and a lot of students are using it as the alternative pathway to university entry.
Yes, yes. It changes completely how they respond. Motivation, I think we call it, don't we? Yes, yes. Yeah. Okay, so there are lots of things for you to consider when you're thinking about training in the workplace, but our goal is the same, to structure a program that is going to work for the learner group that we are working with to achieve the qualification we are offering them. So when we look at how we collaborate in the workplace and the structure of the learning that occurs in that workplace, it's really clear that the information flow between and about the learner and the learning needs has to go both ways. It's no good if only the RTO or only the workplace understands how the learner is progressing. So the questions above there really give you an idea of what should be considered as a minimum when you are communicating between the workplace and the RTO. So what have they learnt when they come to the RTO? What do we want them to actually talk to them about or show them, get them to practice in the workplace? What feedback do we want about their progress? So what are they good at? What do they need to do more work on? And what time frame should this actually occur in? And we've got a couple of examples of how that might happen on pages 8 and 9 of your handout. When we have a look at page 8, this is one that's linked to an apprenticeship. And the unit is about inspecting and servicing engines. So in this example, what is happening is that the inspection and the servicing is something that is put there by the RTO, but the text that you have got there in blue about what's actually been done, the cleaning and inspection, the changing the oil, they're things where the learner is actually filling in what they have done in their week in the workplace. And they're telling you how they have done it. So did I just help someone else do it, or did I do it by myself? So that first part of the table is the learner filling it out, and then their supervisor is filling out the rest of it. So they're saying about how they worked, so behavioural type things, following safety procedures, using specifications, that kind of stuff. And they're saying where they're up to. So in this case, they're saying this person's progressing quite slowly because they've missed quite a bit of work, and in the next week they're going to focus their efforts by putting them with a particular person and focus on mastering basics. So when we look at that feedback, it's great for the workplace, but there's no feedback from the RTO or to the RTO in there. So as an example, that works well in the workplace, but you would need more if you're going to be useful for the RTO. The example that's on page 9 really covers off on all of the things that are sitting in that list there. In this example, we have got information about what has been delivered by the RTO. And we're back to our old favourite, risk assessment. We've got instruction to the workplace about what we want them to talk to the student about, and we have got instruction to the workplace about what we want them to be practicing, and you can see the workplace is ticked off as they have done those things. They've also made comments about the student's strengths and their weaknesses and general comments, and the student has made comment as well. The thing that's great about this example is, of course, that we have got the required actions, so what are we going to do to help this student, and the closeout of those actions. So this example tells us a whole story about what is supposed to be happening in the workplace. The other aspect, of course, of collaborating with the workplace is that we need to focus on how we as RTOs can actually support the workplace to implement training for us. So in my time in the vet sector, which you now know is a very long time, I have actually never come across a workplace that is fortunate enough to have a mind reader that can tell them what you want them to do. We have to tell them what it is that we want them to do. So providing some really clear, targeted information in an induction or like a setup session is helpful to help the workplace to actually understand what the requirements are, what the structure of the program is. And what that does is it's beneficial for everybody who's involved. It's beneficial for the workplace, it's beneficial for the learner, and it's beneficial for you as an RTO. It makes all of our jobs easier and potentially sets up the learner for better outcomes. We need to make sure that the information that we provide to the workplace is simple and easy to use. Most of the people that we're going to work with in the workplace are not vet practitioners. So they don't know all our language and lingo and jargon. And so when we give them our vet documents, they're often pretty hard to decipher and understand. And if we're going to be honest, we sometimes have trouble understanding them ourselves. Why would we expect someone in a workplace to understand that? So we need to make sure that in their language, we have talked to them about what the unit means, what it's trying to achieve, and what we want them to do for us. We need to make sure that communication about the program is consistent and ongoing. Basically, we're saying talk to the people that you're working with, cooperate, because that gives you the opportunity to intervene early when maybe things aren't quite going as well as they should be. We should have ongoing review and feedback about the learner's progress. That is what you would do if you had them in a classroom. Why wouldn't you do the same thing when they're in a workplace? So we monitor progress and we change and adjust things to make sure that that student can achieve that outcome. And ideally, we would also provide some developmental support for the personnel in the workplace who are involved in that training for us. Again, exactly as you would do for your own RTO staff, where you're going to nurture them and develop them. When you do that for the people in the workplace, it's beneficial for everyone, that workplace, for you as the RTO, and for the learner. What you're really doing is building the capacity and capability of that workplace to support training. So on page 11 of your handout, you have a whole lot of resources that might be useful to you as you think about training. This is, again, it's a tiny, tiny list with everything that is out there for you, but it links you to some research about quality training, some templates, and some information about training in the workplace that might be helpful in terms of structuring how you might do that. So the final thing that I want you to do today is to reflect. So I want you to think about your training practice and just spend a minute or so writing down what you're going to pay more attention to, or review or improve in your own training practice. Okay, so thank you so much for joining us today. I hope that there has been something that you have been able to take away from today's session that will be helpful for you in your own training and assessment practice. Training and assessment is, or training in particular, you know, the vast majority of RTOs provide training and we don't focus on it a lot, and we should do. So thank you, enjoy your morning tea. Lisa's going to let us escape out the door.
Well, good morning all, and it's really good to see you. Actually, I hadn't a bit surprised by the reverberation of my voice, but I'll get used to that as the time goes on. Hopefully you'll get used to it too. This is a workshop we're going to be looking at assessment avoiding the pitfalls, and as one does when putting together a workshop, the first thing one thinks about is what picture are you going to show on the first slide. I mean, that's the most important thing. It sets the scene. And so I went to the stock images on Google, I think it might have been, and found this image to describe pitfalls. And then I realised that I'd seen it before. And as a child, I had this game. It's called Labyrinth Spell, and indeed this part of it here is that part there. And so I thought, well, that's a little blast from the past. And then I found it in my shed, still in working condition. As one does, as soon as you discover that, you think, I've got to use this prop somehow. How can I weave this in? Well, basically, this is a game where a ball has to move around a track going past 60 pitfalls. There we go, got the word pitfall in. That's useful. And the device is controlled by simply operating there's no USB, there's no batteries. There are two planes. One is operated by that wheel and one is operated by that wheel. And so fundamentally what you have to be able to do is to balance the planes so that the ball will roll along the track and not fall into the holes. And I thought, you know, that's just awfully like what we're doing with assessment. Much of the time we have to have two conflicting controls. So today, for example, we're going to see that we want to have the idea of flexibility and responsiveness, but which is lovely, that would be great, but on the other hand, we have to balance that with compliance and standards. So we have this problem so often in assessment of trying to balance one thing with another. And that's what's going to happen when we look at these pitfalls, because fundamentally, like this game, dealing with one problem may create another problem, and dealing with that may create another problem, and you end up falling in the hole. But it's a great game because it really does test endurance and patience, and so does being an RTO. You have a handout which describes 30 assessment errors, then modified slightly to sins. I felt that we could call them sins because these are things which we really do know we should not be doing, and yet we do them. And so I thought it would be a little bit stronger if we express them not as errors, which is mistakes, but things that we need to avoid because we know that they're things we need to stay away from. And so in our session today, we're going to look 4 of the 30. I will say that if we have time at the end for questions, I'm happy to look at any of the other 26. But we're going to focus on 4. And these are 4 that have been identified by the Training Accreditation Council as ones that they particularly want to look at in today's session. So the 4 are firstly the issue of simulation and how you assess and how you use simulations within the context of assessment. It's sin 7, so it's the 7th sin in the list of 30. The second one we're going to look at is sufficiency. What is sufficient evidence? And how do you determine whether you have sufficient evidence? That is sin 9, which talks about insufficient evidence. The third one is clustering, which looks at, which relates to sin 23, and looks at the kinds of issues that you might face by building up clusters of competencies and where the pitfalls are in that process. And the final one is customisation. Sin 11 in our collection of 30 sins. And there we're going to look at how far you can go with customisation, or can you customise at all. And so we're going to deal with these. So we have 4 chunks that we're going to deal with, and at the end of each chunk I'll pause to ask if you've got any questions about that chunk before we move on to the next one. And they are a little bit disparate, although they do interconnect. They interconnect in a sense because they are about balance. In each case, we can ask the question, well, how do we deal with this expectation that seems to be competing with another expectation? How can we balance those out? So there's that connection, but you'll also find there's a bit of crosstalk between them that I'll bring to your attention as we go. Of course, as in any of these sessions, what we're doing is working to the standards for RTOs. And of course, I might mention to you that there is a user's guide that TAC produces that looks at the standards. So to the extent that we're going to refer to clauses from the standards, there is also guidance that you can get from the user's guide for the standards. And finally, as you know, there are a set of fact sheets that TAC produces, and of ones that are of particular relevance to us today are the one on assessment. Then there's one on industry engagement, because we will be seeing quite early in the piece that understanding industry through industry engagement is an important way of avoiding pitfalls. There's one on vocational competency and industry currency, which crosstalks with the industry engagement one, because we develop our industry currency through industry engagement. And then there's one on assessment validation, and of course evaluating whether or not you've achieved the standards and that are required by the standards is an assessment validation process. So you'll find that there are lots of resources you can access. In addition to that, if we have time, there'll be opportunity for you to ask questions as we go. So let's start off with the first of our set, which is the simulations. And what I want to start with is the notion that we have unreal simulations much of the time. And what I need to stress here is that what we are dealing with within VET is workplaces. So when you look at the definition of assessment, the definition of competency, the definition of unit of competency in the glossary, they all talk about to workplace standards. And when you look at the whole of the standards. There are 46 references in the standards. You can do that quite quickly. You can discover that through the magic of computing, to the word industry. And that reminds us, as it should, that what we're about is industry, and indeed the natural habitat of a unit of competency is the workplace. Units of competency in VET all come from workplaces. It's one of the reasons why we can talk about RPL, because we understand that since the competencies come from the workplace, it may well be that people have developed those competencies, I don't want to use the word merely, but by being immersed in the workplace and practicing the skills. That's where they come from. And indeed, when it comes to the launch of a new qualification or a new unit of competency, since nobody has it, you have to look for people who have it through workplace experience. That's the notion of equivalence. So the workplaces are a key context. And we find the units of competency from the workplace and we capture it, throw a net over it, drag it into a competency zoo called an RTO, and set the competency up in a cage called a course or a unit of competency. And in that cage, it sits on its own. And we imagine that as we look at that competency and teach that competency and assess that competency, we're assessing and teaching the real thing. But we're not, because the real thing is out there in the real world of work. That's where it roams free. It interacts with other units of competency, both of other people and of within the mind of the individual themselves, and with the competencies of clients. In other words, what we see on campus is like an animal in a zoo. It's lost, it's still there physically, but it's lost its context. And zoos, of course, spend a lot of time trying to simulate the real world by painting trees on concrete walls. But the truth is that it's still just a rough simulation. The animal is not still living as it would in the wild. Indeed, the competencies we have in our competency zoos are not living as they do in the real world. So when we start thinking about simulation, we recognise that what we have is a situation where most units of competency talk about assessment in the workplace. And some units of competency insist that assessment happens in the workplace. Others will say that a simulation is a legitimate way of doing it. But we need to make sure that we haven't got a situation where our simulation has become so unreal that what we're measuring is something that is no longer connected to the workplace. In higher education, when we assess a person, we are saying that they have finished a body of learning. We look back over 3 years and say they have got a degree because they've done a whole lot of stuff. A degree marks the end of something, but a vet qualification marks the beginning of something. It's saying this person is ready to work in the workplace. And so a vet qualification doesn't look backwards, it looks forwards. So when we do an assessment through a simulation, we should not be asking the question, what have they learned? We should be asking the question, what are they now ready to do? And that's a question which is quite different. And indeed, RPL is exactly like that again, because RPL is an assessment which says, well, we're not interested in where you learnt this stuff. The question is, what can you do and what will you be able to do in the future with that? And so competency is a very different kind of game. It does mean that when we come to simulations, we really need to be confident that what we're doing is reflecting the real world. And although in other contexts it may not be so important, in the vet sector it's critical that we get real in our processes. So what do we need to do to get real? And we come back to a good old-fashioned concept, which is the dimensions of competency. If we want to have real simulations, we need to ask ourselves, do these simulations reflect the dimensions of competency? Now, these are familiar to you, so the first one, of course, is task skills. But we can't use a banana to pretend that we're talking on the phone. Bananas, on the most part, are fairly silent when it comes to their role as a simulation. What we need to, of course, is have real equipment and real materials and real interactions. So that we need to make sure that what we have is real equipment and real materials, real personnel. The process, if it's going to have any meaning in terms of a predictive role for future performance, we really do have to make sure that everything in that context is real. That has cost implications, but nonetheless, if we don't do that, what we're going to do is create the illusion of competence, not the reality. The second thing is that real workplaces, there are tasks that compete with each other. So you have to, in real workplaces, prioritise things. You have to be able to order things. You have to sequence things. You have to sometimes deal with conflicting tasks at the same time. Now, under those sort of circumstances, a simulation that provides a very clean, purified, clinical kind of assessment is not going to reflect the real world. And when they step out into the real world, they're going to be shocked to discover that you don't do this competency on this day and then you do another competency the next day, but you have to deal with all these things in concert with each other and in harmony with each other, and that's quite a challenge. Indeed, we also find in real workplaces things go wrong. So we don't want to make our simulation so perfectly managed that nothing ever goes wrong. We want to make our simulation messy and troublesome, because real workplaces are messy and troublesome. That's what happens. Technology fails, he says, keeping his fingers crossed. And things go wrong, and the question is not, can you operate within the perfect world, which is a bit like the sort of clinical perfect world that a caged animal might live in, but can your competency live in the chaotic world of the real workplace? And that means that we need to introduce problems and faults and challenges. And finally, we need to understand that the workplace is a visceral kind of place. It's a place where of emotions and stresses, cost implications, time pressures, fatigue, COVID, all those sorts of things come into play. And so workplaces are complex and chaotic. They all are. I mean, if it's not, it's a weird kind of world that you're working in. So fundamentally, we need to make sure that all of these qualities are part of our simulation. And to do that, you need to draw upon your industry expertise. In other words, you need to know how real workplaces work. And that basically means we need to look for your vocational competencies and your current industry skills. And so when it comes to vocational competency, you basically need to have either the skill itself, or you can demonstrate equivalence. You either have the competency itself, or you can demonstrate equivalence, which you might have derived from workplace activities and workplace experience. And that is a perfectly legitimate way to do things, because that's where competencies actually come from. And when it comes to industry skills, then you need to make sure that you maintain direct links with the industry that you serve, or industries, because your unit of competency might serve a number of different industries. And so that you can understand that when you create a simulation, what you're doing is reflecting that industry. So it's not good enough just to have industry come and look at what you're doing. They won't really know and understand what you're doing. You are the person with the expertise to be able to go into industry and look at what they're doing and saying, oh, that's interesting, I could build that into my simulation, or that's something I need to avoid. You will learn things from watching what goes on in industry, which will enable you to enrich the environment in which you deliver and assess units of competency. And in that sense, you will be able to turn unreal simulations into real simulations. So when you're using simulations to assess units of competency, you need to first reflect on your current industry knowledge and skills. Identify tasks that provide the learner with the opportunity to demonstrate some or all of the unit skill requirements in a way which reflects the current practices of industry. And you need to make sure that you are going to be able to show that you are demonstrating all 4 dimensions of competency. So that gives you a rubric, if you like, to analyse your simulations, a way of saying, well, is this simulation real, or is it so artificial that I will be coming to false conclusions about what a person can achieve? I came across this cartoon, though, from Lunig many years ago, which is time bomb diffusing third-year prac exam, I do want to suggest, though, that sometimes simulation is dangerous. And under those circumstances, or for that matter, assessment in the workplace is dangerous. So you always do have to take into consideration what is risky and what is not. And I guess in some cases we have to be honest and say, well, we know this person can operate in a simulated situation, but we can't be sure they can operate in a real one. So with first aid, we might use mannequins. Working with a mannequin is quite different to working with a real human being who is vomiting and is upset and in danger and is crying out in pain. The mannequins don't do any of those things. Maybe there are some really sophisticated ones that do. The point I'm trying to get at here is you can hope that the person demonstrating on a mannequin would behave the same way with a real person, but you can't know. So what you try to do is to make your simulation as close as you can to the real thing so that you can say at the end of the day, this person is work ready. And when that happens, you're fine. I might say, by the way, that some areas like nursing and others have a simulation to begin with because it's safe and controlled and managed, and then you go into the real workplace. But it's not until you go into the real workplace that you are actually demonstrating competency. Up to that point, what you're doing is demonstrating readiness to work in a real workplace, but not necessarily proving that you're competent. So think about your simulations. They're a really good way to go, but they can be quite expensive. Setting up a restaurant and a real kitchen, a real industrial kitchen is going to be expensive. Setting up a hairdressing salon is going to be expensive. Setting up simulations of hospitals or wards or play areas are going to be expensive. And so you do have to ask yourself the question, can I do it? If you can't do it right, don't do it. If you can't do it right, don't have it on your scope. Because fundamentally what you'll do is create the illusion of competence, and ultimately you could be running serious risks for your students and their employers and their clients, because the people that you're training are not truly competent, just within the zoo and that controlled environment, they appear to be competent. The second theme is sufficiency, and we're going to be looking at gathering sufficient evidence and the requirements there. And it's interesting that what we're trying to do with our assessment process is to convict someone of being competent. We need to have sufficient evidence to prove beyond reasonable doubt that they're guilty of being competent. And it's not surprising that there's a kind of quasi-legal language there. Right from the very early days when we started talking about competencies, and we understood that we were in an evidence-based world. And the basic idea of assessment is that you gather evidence, there you're being a kind of detective, and then you make a judgment, now you're being a judge. And fundamentally the rules of evidence are basically the rules of evidence that you might apply within the context of a law court. Is it authentic? Is it really about this person, or did someone else commit the crime? Is it sufficient? Do we have enough evidence, enough corroborating evidence to be able to say, yes, there's reason to believe it was that person and not somebody else, and it was really a crime committed by them? Validity basically is saying, well, does it apply? Is there a law that applies to this? So we need to ask ourselves the question, is the evidence relevant to the law? And when it comes to the currency, did they do it now or did they do it 10 years ago? And those sorts of questions basically are the questions we ask when it comes to competency. So there is a sense in which we are using that sort of quasi-legal language. And so we're going to focus today on sufficiency. And what we are basically saying is, well, what is enough evidence to be able to convict a person of being competent? Most units of competency basically say that you need to be, I think I've jumped a bit ahead here, or a bit behind. Most units of competency will say at least once, which is a bit spooky because you can't possibly imagine that less than once would be a good assessment process. And indeed, I have to say as an auditor that if you assess at least once, or just once, you've met the standard. But is that a good standard? And what we need to think about is what really truly is sufficient. If we look at assessment in this way, and I know that a unit of competency is multidimensional and therefore I can't express it in a simple chart like this, but just for sort of conceptualising it, I think it works. But basically a person starts without the competency, we put them through a training program through which they develop competency, and at some point they pass a threshold. That threshold will of course be that they have achieved a point where they have mastered all the facets of competency, the elements, performance criteria, foundation skills, performance evidence requirements and the knowledge evidence requirements. And if we carry out an assessment at that point, what we are able to say is, yes, they've arrived. They've demonstrated the quality. But what happens next? Well, we don't know. If we do a one-shot assessment, we don't know what happens next. And VET is about what happens next. It's not about what happened up to then. That's higher education. In VET, it's about what happens next. So weirdly, a one-shot assessment will work in higher education because the question is, did you reach the benchmark? It's not, will you stay there? But in VET, we want to know that a person will stay there. And if we look at the definition of a unit of competency, we can see that there are very clear messages in the definition in the standards. The first is that there needs to be consistent performance. And by consistent performance, we need to know that performance will be sustained and is repeatable. Now that's basically telling us that one assessment won't do, because you can't judge consistency on the basis of one assessment. But it also talks about transfer. And so when it talks about transfer, you recognise that you can't judge transfer from a one-shot assessment. You can only judge transfer by seeing the competency being performed in more than one context with a range of different conditions. Then we know there's transfer. And indeed it talks about range of circumstances and conditions in the definition in the glossary. So we can't see these things with a one-shot assessment. So when it says at least once, it might be sufficient within the context and the frame of the unit, but it's not sufficient within the context of the definition of competency in the glossary. Now, we as auditors are required to assess you with respect to what the unit says. That's all we can do. But so at this point, we're really talking about what is best practice and what is ideal practice, but also it protects you because it means that you will be able to make safer, more credible judgments at the end of the process. So what you need is a second assessment. And the second assessment enables you to do a number of things. One of them, of course, is you can now vary the conditions, so you can see transfer. It's a second assessment will happen after a modest period of time, which means you'll be able to see consistency. Did they do it again and then again? And the second assessment will enable you to do all sorts of things which the first assessment won't do. There's an old joke which says that, bumper sticker which says, if I'd known grandchildren were so much fun, I would have had them first. And you do sometimes come across people who say, now I know the second assessment is so valuable, why don't I just do that? The truth is you need two. If you want to see consistency, you need two. If you want to see transfer, you need to see two. But the second assessment adds enormously in terms of value. And it adds value in relation to the way in which students learn. So, for example, the students are more likely to understand that what we're interested in is not the task, but the competencies underlying the task. Because the task is just a vehicle that you temporarily use in order to convey a competency and to then assess the presence or absence of the competency. So the task is not the objective. We're not task-based, we're competency-based. So as soon as you have a second task, which is different from the first, the only thing that is common to both tasks will be the competency. And you've suddenly changed what might be rote learning, where a person just remembers stuff. This is how I do the task and that's what I'll do and the lecturer will be happy. Now they've got to go back in underneath the task and say, what is it about these two tasks that they share, and it'll be that they share the competency. You'll get what's called meaningful learning. And meaningful learning, while it might take a little bit more effort, you keep for life. Whereas rote learning, you have to keep rehearsing. You know, do you remember your previous phone numbers? Probably not. You remember your current one because you've recited and you practice it and you keep it front of mind. But the old phone numbers you'll forget because they are rote learned. There's no meaning in them. But anything that you experienced in your past that was meaningfully learned, part of the network of understandings that you have, will stay with you and require almost no rehearsal and refreshment. So the bigger benefit of the second assessment, one of the big benefits, is meaningful learning. And so you can see that assessment does have an impact, and the way we assess can have an impact on the practices and habits, if you like, of students when it comes to learning. Of course, also that they are more likely to retain things in long-term memory. They will know that they have to retain this over a number of assessments and not just be able to perform it once and then forget it. And that does mean that although there could still be some decline afterwards, the decline will not be so dramatic as it would have been if there was a one-shot assessment. And of course, you can see that there's transfer to new situations and to new tasks. And given that our qualifications are forward-looking, that's what we want. We want a person not to be able to go out and just do what they were taught in terms of tasks. We want them to go out and apply competencies to tasks that are yet unknown, to tasks which you might not even know about or may not have seen. And given the diversity of industry, you can't represent all the tasks, but you can represent all the competencies and that apply to those tasks. And that is where the second assessment is so valuable, because it says to the student, it's not the task I'm interested in, it's the competency underpinning the task that I'm interested in. So to sum up, when you're to gather sufficient evidence, when designing your assessment strategies, you need to consider how many times you'll need to observe a skills to be sure, first of all, that you can observe consistent performance, and that does mean we need to assess more than once. And twice might be enough, but you might still decide that there needs to be more assessments to really establish consistency. We can observe transfer across a range of applications, and again, twice would be the minimum, but more might be necessary, and indeed some training package units require vast numbers of assessments, hospitality as a case in point, before transfer is understood to be adequate. You can eliminate chance performance. You can basically say, well, they couldn't have fluked this because I've assessed them twice in two different ways. And you can also check on authenticity, because a person might be able to fool you once, but the chance of them fooling you twice is less. Still possible, but less. And also you can verify reliability and that rule of evidence of sufficiency. So you can pick up on those principles of assessment of reliability and the rule of evidence of sufficiency through that process. But I do want to stress that you must be careful not to over-assess. There's a sort of law of diminishing returns, that the second assessment will tell you a great deal more than the first, but the third assessment begins to tell you less, and the fourth and fifth assessments less again. What you've established with that second assessment is consistency and transfer. The third assessment may not tell you much more. So do be careful that you don't sort of follow the rule of thumb which says if 2 is better than 1, 3 is better than 2. It actually begins to become a problem if you start over-assessing. So really that balance business again comes into play. 1 is not enough in terms of best practice. 2 is certainly enough in terms of best practice, and then you have to make a judgment based on your industry skills about what more is needed for you to be able to make a safe prediction about a person's future performance in the workplace. Are there any other questions about sufficiency that you might ask? Yes. There's a microphone coming your way.
Just on that note, with a lot of the new training packages that we work with, the frequencies have actually increased.
Yes. And I think that's partly because of this concern about the sort of one shot or the assessments not giving an adequate prediction of future performance. But I will say that I've looked at some units of competency and it does seem to be unnecessarily heavy. But as auditors and as you as RTOs, we have to stick to what the standard says. and we might bridle at it from time to time, but we have to stick with what it says. The thing that you need to do is to make sure that you're getting maximum value from each of those extra assessments. And that could be in part that you move your focus so that you might well establish competence in the first couple of assessments and then establish more transfer in the subsequent assessments. So you might find that, well, I don't need to ask the basic questions again. I can now move on and ask, well, am I seeing transfer? And that could mean that your early assessments might be have a focus on the fundamentals of competency, and the later assessments might focus more on transfer. And that will give you a chance to, if you like, lighten those other assessments, so long as competency in terms of the particular requirement, the element or the foundation skill or whatever is well established. I might say, by the way, too, that those extra requirements I think always apply to the elements and performance criteria and not to knowledge. So one-shot assessment of knowledge is usually adequate. And foundation skills, again, one-shot assessment of the foundation skills would be adequate. So we're really only talking about the elements where you would need to go further. And as I said before, you could refocus what you're looking for to make those further assessments less onerous. Okay, let's move on to our third topic, which is clustering. And I've described this as cluttered clustering. And I want you to imagine for a moment that we were looking at a brick wall. And the name of the game is to get to the top of that brick wall. One sort of gets in the image of these climbing walls that mad people climb up, with little handholds and so on as they scrabble up a vertical surface. It's difficult to do that. And it requires a lot of training and a lot of time, not to be at the top of the wall, but to get to the top of the wall. And so the climb from the floor to the ceiling, and if we try to do it in a single leap, we've got no chance at all. Now imagine that those bricks are pushed out to form a staircase. Suddenly what you've got is the ability to get to the top of the wall. The steps are small, and you can climb your way to the top and achieve the top. And keeping in mind that in VET it's about being at the top of the wall, that's important, not how you got there. You might already be there, that's called RPL, in which case the question is, are you really at the top of the wall? Then go on into the world of work. So we're not worried about the climbing of the wall is not the name of the game. In higher education, the climbing of the wall is the game. That is, can you work for 3 years single-mindedly to achieve an outcome? So the degree at the end of higher education marks where you've been. But in our case, we're not interested in where you've been, we're interested in where you're going. So we are quite happy to put steps in and enable people to climb. And what this does is provide, first of all, achievable goals. Jumping from the floor to the ceiling is not achievable, but climbing small steps is. So they're all achievable. And as you climb each step, you get reinforcement. You are moving forward, you're advancing, you're developing your qualities and skills. So you can take those steps and get small steps that are achievable and repeated reinforcement, which is good. It's much less risky because you're not launching everything into that one giant leap. If you do a degree in physiotherapy, you're either at the top or you're nowhere. Being half a physiotherapist is nothing. You're nobody, you're useless. But being half of a builder is useful because there are builders' labourers where you can work in building with a certificate 2. You don't have to have a certificate 3, you can have a certificate 2 or even a certificate 1 if in fact the wall is far too high for you to climb. So what you have is a situation where you just invest in progressing forward a little bit each time. You don't take that huge leap and risk that is associated with being all or nothing, which is really dangerous. We can sharpen our focus on learning and assessment because we can say, well, what does this step really entail? What qualities does this step involve? We can be quite precise about the skills and the knowledge and even the foundation skills, which often relate to the steps further down. and that enables us to make sure that the climb can be well managed by ourselves as trainers and well understood and well managed by our students as learners. So there's that sharper focus on learning and assessment, and it becomes quite clear exactly what is meant by success with that step. We actually can talk about greater flexibility in training because we can say, well, that step didn't work, what about this step? Is there another way we can get there? Or the student might change their plans or their ambitions, in which case we can say, well, how can that step lead to another outcome? So there are a number of sort of landings up the staircase, a certificate 1 landing, a certificate 2 landing, a certificate 3 landing and so on, at which point a person can change direction. That's wonderful from a flexibility point of view. And then when it comes to workplace application, each of these steps, each of these bricks, if you like, can be rearranged to make something else. The lovely thing about bricks is that they can make walls, but you can also take the same bricks and make a barbecue, or you can take the same bricks and make a letterbox. And it's true of competencies. You can take the same competencies that you learnt for this trade or this particular area of industry and rearrange them to serve another area of industry, another direction, another professional pathway. Really important when we come to things like industrial reform and change, where an industry might begin to collapse through various reasons, in which case the workforce needs to start rearranging its competencies. It doesn't just abandon everything and say, that's it, I'm finished, I'm useless. You basically say, hang on, you bring a whole bunch of competencies which you acquired through work and through training. Now can we rearrange those competencies to serve some other function? So competencies are a fabulous idea, but the big problem with them that we have is they can tend to compartmentalise. Going back to the competency zoo, the competency becomes an isolated cell where the competency exists in a kind of compartment that means it no longer interacts with other competencies. We have a tiger, a lion in this cage and a gazelle in that cage, but in real life there's no wall between the lion and the gazelle, and we should knock the wall down to see how they interact. And that is called clustering. Fundamentally, what we basically are going to do is to get rid of the fragmentation and the disjointedness, and start looking to say, how can we combine these separate entities in a way which makes things more meaningful? And of course there are other benefits as well. One of the problems is that quite often things are inefficient and repetitive. So you'll find that basically you might find that two units share the same knowledge base. And you've got lecturer A teaching it and the knowledge and assessing it, and lecturer B teaching the same knowledge and assessing it, where in actual fact you could combine together, teach the knowledge as a shared component, and then just address the skills as a separate component, again back to those individual lecturers, and you've cut down the amount of training. And in doing so, what you've done is reduce the pressure and strain, and even for that matter the confusion on the part of the students. And of course the thing is that these separate isolated competencies can become dissociated from real work, because you don't walk into a job and say, on Thursday I'm doing this competency, and on Friday I'll do that competency, and on Monday I'll do another one. As we said before, when it came to simulation, these things all have to work harmoniously together. That's what happens. So fundamentally what's happened is, in a sense, clustering is a way of simulating the real world. We can actually say the real world involves competencies working together. So there are lots and lots of motivations and reasons for clustering. And we might cluster on the basis of first things that go together in the real workplace. And that's a very logical thing to do. And indeed, when you think about it, assessment of the cluster will have better predictive validity of a person's future performance in the workplace than looking at those components separately. The second thing is that they can provide support to each other because they may well share common resources. Maybe the same lecturer can teach both. And given the fact that the lecturer is doing both, the lecturer will produce some harmony and relationship between them. Or it might be there's a mode of delivery. Here we've got 4 separate topics, but we're all in the same room, so we'll cluster the 4 topics together and present a single workshop dealing with 4 topics. And you'll see that from time to time I hook one topic into another topic. And that's because these things are interrelated. It is natural when you think about clustering to think about workplace as you do with simulation. There are constant themes. That helps make everything more meaningful. Again, that word meaningful, which was in the previous segment. So you can see that what we have is lots of reasons for clustering. I mentioned before the fact that they might share the same skills or the same knowledge base. And again, that will have the effect of reducing the amount of training. So there can be kind of conceptual reasons, such as to reflect the workplace better, and there can be kind of pragmatic reasons, and instrumental reasons if you like, because we're going to save time, cut down the amount of training, achieve more efficiencies. But balance kicks in again. I mean, we turn one wheel and we find, well, we're going to go clustering, but we now have a problem. And the first problem is we have less achievable goals. Now they have the bigger steps. We've just suddenly amalgamated steps together and now the steps become big. We have less frequent reinforcement because what's going to happen is that they're going to be longer on those 2 units or 3 units, and I've sometimes seen 5 or 6 units clustered together, which is a monstrous wall for an individual student to climb. But think very carefully about that. Because they're not going to get reinforcement until they've finished the whole lot. And by the way, what's going to happen is you either get the lot or you get nothing. You can't go sort of get this bit and not that bit, because you may be able to through an appropriate assessment process, but these things all interact with each other. If you're being overwhelmed by a tough unit, you won't succeed in the one that you otherwise might have achieved. Because these units begin to interplay with each other. So you've got an issue of reinforcement. You have a problem of investment in time, that the person is going to have to launch into this cluster in the hope that they'll come out the other end as competent, and so they're going to make a big investment. Much less flexibility in training, and for that matter in assessment. So if a person presents to you with one of the units from a cluster for RPL, what are you going to do? If you RPL them, they don't need to do that, but that's the way I teach it. That's the way I assess it. You're going to have to do it again. So you've lost flexibility. And there might be also loss of flexibility in workplace application. So fundamentally, the lovely thing about separate units is that a person can rearrange their units so that they can fit jobs that we may not know are out there or that may not yet exist. But as soon as you start lumping things together, it becomes much more difficult. It's a bit like Lego. Lego made up of little bricks. The little bricks in Lego have no particular meaning. It's only when you assemble them together that they actually get a meaning. So now if you glue the Lego together, it suddenly becomes useless because, except for that one meaning. I used to bring along a little Lego helicopter. And I'd glued it all together, much to my children's horror, because all that could be is a helicopter. But if you didn't glue the bricks together, it could become a person or a boat or a house. In other words, it was the fact that these things were separate that made the flexibility that you needed. And there could be a loss of focus in learning and assessment. So we need to balance these things. When we come to assess units in a cluster, we need to, I'm just making sure we're up to this, we need to make sure the cluster is not too large. We need to make sure that the units are of similar complexity so that one unit doesn't destroy another unit. We need to make sure that the units don't get locked into a particular cluster so that they're only seen as coexistent with each other, with a particular task or function. And we need to be able to say that the evidence that we gather from the clustered assessment can be teased apart to make unit judgments. So if we get the requirements of this unit and the requirements of that unit, combine them together in a cluster, gather the evidence, we cannot say they've passed or failed until we look at the evidence for this unit and look at the evidence for that unit and then say they've passed or failed that unit, they've passed or failed that unit. I know the words pass and fail bother you a bit, but competent, not yet competent becomes a bit of a mouthful. So fundamentally, what we are basically need to be able to do, if we do have clustered delivery, but most importantly, if we have clustered evidence gathering, we need to be able to tease the components apart so we can make competency judgments. So to sum up, fundamentally, clustering is good for training, delivery and assessment, but we must not make clustered competency-based decisions. We must make sure that we make competency-based decisions. And so the judgment that we make has to be precisely related to each unit and not to some entity of our own invention, which is the cluster of those units. I'm going to keep on going because I've had the 10-minute warning, and then we may hopefully have some time at the end to look back at clustering and customisation for questions. Customisation is our last topic, and here again is the balance problem, because when it comes to customisation, we're told that we must be responsive to learners and flexible and fair. And so we might find ourselves asking questions like, well, I know this unit of competency is, or this aspect of a unit of competency is beyond my learners. You know, it requires them to write a report, but they're not terribly literate, so I'll let them do it orally. Or I might just leave that bit out, in which case you say, well, what you've done is customised. You've changed the unit of competency because it says they have to write a report. But you'll also sometimes find people adding things in. They say, how do I know that they've mastered this? What I'll do is get them to do a PowerPoint presentation. And you sort of say, hang on, you've added stuff into the unit of competency. You've made it harder. You've changed its focus. And in real life, in the workplace, they would not be doing a PowerPoint presentation. You know, you don't go in there to have your car serviced and they say, hang on, I'm just going to run through this PowerPoint presentation with you. It's just not going to happen like that. So fundamentally, we've got to be very careful that we don't leave stuff out or put stuff in because we think it's a good idea, or because we think we're being fair, or because, or for that matter, we're being more thorough or more careful. And we might find that there's something about the unit that's a bit old-fashioned. I mean, the units do take a while to change. And we say, but industry is doing it much better this way now, so I'll add that in. Add it into your training, by all means, but you can't add it into your assessment. Because if it's not there in the standard, if it's not there in the unit of competency, you cannot add it in of your own volition. So you have to be awfully careful that you don't start customising things. Because at the end of the day, the standards that we deal with are national standards. They're not WA standards, they're not enterprise standards, they're not your standards, they're national standards. And so fundamentally you must subscribe to them. And so any kind of customisation where you put stuff in or change the meaning of things or leave things out constitutes an invalidation of the standard. And that can have very serious consequences. And when I say serious, I mean deadly serious consequences. Because you might have left something out that makes a dangerous circumstance. I remember seeing an RTO a long, long time ago which left out an aspect of administering drugs because that's not how it's done in their particular organisation. But you have to say, but it is done in other organisations, and so you must train your students to do this, even though you don't do it. Because if you don't, then they might administer drugs incorrectly in another institution, and under those circumstances they could do great harm. So it's not a choice that you have that you can customise. What we're saying instead is what you need to do is to contextualise. Now that just sounds like a little bit of sort of a language game, and it isn't really at all. Customisation merely does mean you have changed the standard. Contextualisation simply means that you have reinterpreted the standard without changing it. And so you are basically going to say, well, what are the characteristics of my students? What are the characteristics of my industry? What are the characteristics? What I have in the way of resources? Can I change the way in which the unit is worded but not change what the unit is. And that's contextualisation. So we would like you to think strongly about contextualisation. Contextualisation does not involve any deletions, additions or alterations. It just involves the re-expression of unit requirements so that everybody understands what's going on. And that could be observers, it could be your students, it could be supervisors in workplace. But it does not allow you to deliver in a language other than English. Whenever in doubt, think about industry. That's where your students are going. And if they're going into an environment, as they would, where English is the language of the standard language, then you must deliver and assess in English. So this kind of contextualisation of changing the language would actually invalidate what you're doing because it wouldn't conform to what industry requires. Now, you can deliver in another language, but then you have to declare on the certificate that it was delivered in a different language. But you can't just, for this particular student or that particular student, wheel in a translator and deliver through that process. That would not be acceptable form of contextualisation. So we can see contextualisation as a way to move forward and avoid customisation. And basically what we are seeing here is we are changing the description of the unit requirements and the learning materials and the assessment tools. We may be contextualising to reflect our learners, our observers, our enterprises or our local industry, which means you need to know about your learners and their needs, and you need to know about industry and its needs and its protocols and processes. We're all back to, quite often we go back to current industry skills. And in that way we are able to contextualise what we do without actually changing the standard. And if I can just finish up with one last word, which is about reasonable adjustment. Reasonable adjustment is often mistaken for contextualisation. And you'll notice that I've put reasonable adjustment here with a capital R and a capital A. And the reason I have is because reasonable adjustment is not just being a good trainer. It's actually required by law under the Disability Discrimination Act. And it relates not to just the person who's struggling with language literacy and numeracy, but to people with defined disabilities. So the word reasonable adjustment, and I'm employed to be a pedant, so I'm going to be quite pedantic about this. The words reasonable adjustment relate to that specific situation where a person presents with a disability, and your job is to ask yourself the question, can I make reasonable adjustments that will enable this person to achieve and demonstrate competency? Now, keeping in mind the word reasonable, and the word reasonable also means that the industry is going to be able to offer the same reasonable adjustments. If industry can't make those adjustments, what you're offering is false sense of competence. It's not a reasonable adjustment. Reasonable adjustment means you cannot leave things out of a unit or add things into a unit. You have to stick to the unit exactly as it is. Reasonable adjustment means that it mustn't send you broke, or it mustn't impede that person's access, or it mustn't impede the access to other students to learning. So the word reasonable there is critical. And so we need to be careful that we don't customise in the name of reasonable adjustment. And I do want to stress here that this does relate to people with disabilities. If a person has language literacy and numeracy problems because of brain injury, that would be a disability. But if they have language literacy and numeracy problems because they had a poor schooling, that is not a disability. And what becomes is just good training on your part to respond to that. I'm sure that's the sort of thing that Claire talked with you about a good deal. So fundamentally we need to understand the words reasonable adjustment provide a form of contextualisation and certainly not customisation to cope with the needs of your learners. So we'll finish at that point and say, do we have any questions that people want to ask about any of the 4 topics, or indeed about any of the other 26 sins? There's a lot there for you to pick from. We don't just have 7 sins, we go right out to 26, to 30. Any questions? Well, look, thank you very much for being with us today. We do have a question. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, Russell, I don't know whether might be one for Kane as well. I'm just really interested in, has there been any discussions, given the COVID climate, good practice on what's acceptable and not acceptable in gathering evidence?
Look, I have to tell you that there was a recent NCVR report which was fascinating because it looked at the impact of COVID and on training and assessment, and it found over 50% of the problems related to authenticity and also to the quality of assessments. At the same time, the NCVR published a report on how to do distance learning. The word assessment does not appear in that document anywhere, not at all. So people are very good at identifying problems and not very good at identifying solutions.
So I was just wondering, is there going to be an opportunity maybe for us to come together and maybe just have a look at what sort of, is there a benchmark of what's acceptable, not acceptable? What are actually other people doing?
That's a question for Kane and for TAC.
It would be really quite valuable. We're not, obviously, you know, we're in an education setting, as I know some of my other colleagues are. So we're sort of doing a blend of online and face-to-face. Online when they're in isolation or COVID positive, back in the you know. So
and that blended approach is really beautiful because you can use the face-to-face time to authenticate the online time. And so fundamentally you'll never know if something done online is in fact authentic. You just won't know. And all sorts of invigilation processes and programs are all beatable. You can get round them without too much trouble. But what you can't get round is face-to-face. So if you've got a blended process, that's brilliant because it enables you to say, well, what I'll do is I'll reassess some aspects of what I received from you online. If there's consistency, I'll figure that what I got from you online is truth. And if there's inconsistency, I'll start asking the question, did someone else do your work online? And so it may be other reasons why there's inconsistency, but at least it begins to tell you that there could be a problem. But it's certainly the case. And way back when Murdoch University went mainly online with its program, I think they found about 40% of the work being done by students was someone else's. When UWA did an analysis of assessments being done in universities across Australia and found at least 20% was plagiarised, but there were a whole lot of other forms of fraud apart from plagiarism which they didn't count, which would probably push it up towards the 40%. So fundamentally it's a big issue. And indeed, given that when we declare a person to be competent, we're making a statement which is for which we have to be held accountable, because we are not simply saying they've survived a body of learning, we're saying they're ready and safe to work. And if that's not true, because someone has pulled the wool through cheating, we could find ourselves bearing a significant cost. It's really a big issue.
I think it would be just really valuable if we had an opportunity to talk amongst colleagues to see just how are they validating and verifying, and just what sort of means are people using.
Yeah, we did a fact sheet recently on distance learning, but happy to take that Natalie and
Yeah, but you hit the nail on the head. There's particularly in these COVID times, we always knew it was an issue, but now it's really loud. Thank you very, very much. No further questions? Thank you.